Federal authorities currently use these tools and data they collect through ICE and Homeland Securities to surveil those who are immigrants and those seeking gender-affirming care and violate their rights to privacy and will, in fact, decrease public safety.
Well, that is some of the plentiful public comment this week from the full council meeting of the Seattle City Council, with concerns raised over the implementation of the city's new police surveillance system. With the threat of a National Guard takeover and immigration crackdown in cities like Seattle, how could that surveillance footage be used? Plus, what about some other tools for public safety? Specifically, stay out of drug areas, stay out of areas of prostitution. Are those working for the city of Seattle? And also, can a council member do anything when a local grocery store shuts down? We're engaging on these questions and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, none other than David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I wanted to check in with you on this. I am trying this year to really adhere to the fact that summer doesn't officially end until September 22nd. I'm sticking with shorts and sunglasses until then. Am I crazy? Yes or no? What do you got?
No, September in the Northwest is always quite nice. You know, it's a great month. So yes, I'm fully supportive.
All right. That's all I needed. Just one vote, and that's just the way I'm going to do it. I love it. Thank you, David, as always. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso, on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to patrons of the show. If you would like to support the program, go for it. Great time as we ramp up towards election season here. You can access patrons first content, get your own decal, even send in questions to the show. So much going on here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can find it all on Patreon. Make sure you check it out. Also, watch this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's do this thing. Time for Right Here, Right Now. So the concern at the full council meeting this week for a majority of commenters was this idea that expanding surveillance technology, in doing this, Seattle has opened the door basically for some major civil liberties violations. This, of course, in light of the threats from the Trump administration to take over or go to war against certain cities like Seattle, using the National Guard as an immigration crackdown force. David, I know there's been a lot spoken about this, but how real do you think this possibility is that the feds could somehow come in, take control over Seattle's real-time crime center, use video surveillance for their deportation goals?
Yeah, the backers of this surveillance say it's not that real, that they've put in the protections that they feel like they need to prevent that from happening. My sense is one of the big questions is around, third-party vendors, if that footage lives somewhere else with a private company who they contract with. Are there weak spots in that chain? And then, I suppose there's always the legal side of this, which is what happens if, the federal government comes with warrants and brings those to a judge. How forcefully can the city decline to use those things? But, the argument has been that, basically the juice is worth the squeeze on this, that we feel like we've put enough protections in place to keep that from happening, and that it is worth the trade-off of more information for cracking down on crime, particularly violent crime.
Yeah, and this is such an interesting time right now. Election season has definitely ramped a few things up here. We have a lot of different local officials talking about this, especially people who are running for office this fall, vocally pushing back on the Trump administration. I should say, aside from Rachel Savage, the Republican Trump supporter who's running for citywide position 8, watch out for that debate on the Seattle channel, folks. It is going to be a wild one. I have talked to her recently. Very interesting. But David, my question is, what power does the city really have if the president makes orders like this to send in the National Guard? Is there anything Seattle can do? You mentioned that legal precedent there. I'm wondering what happens if indeed this invasion, or whatever you want to call it, comes to Seattle.
I think that's an open question across the country. There was a judge clear the way for the actions that took place in L.A., basically saying those were legal. And, if they are conducting federal law enforcement action, there's not really that much the city can do to prevent that because they're enforcing federal law. The question is, what pretenses does that lead to? They can say they're enforcing federal law, and then, are they using that as an excuse to expand operations into doing other things?
Sure.
Of course, Washington, D.C., where this has already been happening, is a different case because the federal government has a lot more jurisdiction there than they do in other cities. But certainly this federal government has not been one to shy away from pushing legal boundaries. And there has been a lot of bluster. I think I even saw Tom Homan, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, saying that there could be something this week in some sanctuary cities. We haven't seen anything like that so far, and it's hard to know what's bluster and political theater versus what's real.
Yeah.
Not to mention, how much capacity is there in the National Guard to do any of this? I don't know the answer to that. So a lot of open questions. I think probably the answer from the city of Seattle, if the National Guard were to be sent here, is to go to court and try and get a court order. But other than that, I don't know exactly what the city can do.
Yeah. It's one of those wait and see situations that I know no one really wants to see, but we are going to have to wait. That's definitely the equation that's happening there. So, yeah, we'll see what happens next there, David. Thanks for engaging on that with me. But I did want to talk about another public safety issue involving the feds, if you will, the federal consent decree the Seattle Police Department has been under since 2012. That has finally been lifted. This news coming just a few days ago. This federal oversight was as a result of use of force abuses and biased policing. Since that time, the police department has undergone sweeping changes, we understand, to its policies, procedures, discipline, oversight, and analytics. Massive questions here, David, but I just wanted to make sure I engaged it to try to start off things here. What does this mean that the consent decree has been lifted? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's momentous. I think it's something that a lot of mayors have wanted to have happen under their watch, and Harold gets the one to do it. Though I will say it also feels a little anticlimactic. I think that's probably because most of the parameters of the consent decree had already fallen away. Some of the big picture stuff the city was already technically in compliance with.
Right.
Basically all that was left was this question of accountability. What systems are there to hold officers accountable? Is that doing enough?
Yeah.
Here the judge is saying I guess the city has. I also think it's worth pointing out that basically the consent decree has zero support from anybody at the local level anymore. That the police department, of course, the Police Officers Guild has, of course, always hated it. So they're happy to see it go. The police department brass has been arguing for many years that they have done everything they needed to do under the federal consent decree. City Hall is tired of paying the large sums of money for it and feels like they've done enough. And, a lot of police reformers and people on the left are saying, actually having a federal judge needing to approve every single thing we do to the Seattle Police Department is a barrier to us improving the police department.
Got in the way. Yeah, right.
And of course, the federal government doesn't want it there either. The Trump administration is not particularly interested in having consent decrees on the city. So I do think that's an important point, that at this point in the trajectory of the consent decree, there's nobody making the argument that the city should still be under a consent decree, which is telling. And so I think that's in part why it feels anticlimactic. It's not so much this big, hey, we did it, everyone. It's more of like, all right, finally.
Yeah, done with this paperwork, I guess. Yeah. And your colleague, Mike Carter, was writing about this in the Times, and I was very interested to see what he reported about what was happening in court. The judge there, Judge Robart, he's been on this case for more than a decade, raising concerns about how members of the police union, you brought up SPOG a little while ago, they've been pushing back on these reforms over the years. And I'm just still left with the fact that whatever the SPD does in the future, when it comes to working on conduct, when it comes to working on accountability, it's going to have to be negotiated still with the police union. And I'm not sure what that means for the long-term health of all of this consent decree progress, if you want to call it that.
Which has always been the worst kept secret and sort of cloud hanging over the entire consent decree is the police union was never part of the lawsuit that led to the consent decree. They are not a party to the consent decree. And so therefore, while the officers as police officers in the Seattle Police Department are obligated to follow what the federal judge said, the guild itself is not. They have zero obligation to negotiate away what they think of as their accountability measures, because the federal judge has no power over them. And
yeah, they tried to enter a lawsuit of their own in 2014, I think, to try to block some of this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And Robart over the years, I used to cover this more closely than I do now, but Robart over the years had made threats, sort of basically threatening to bring the guild into this because he was so frustrated with their intransigence at the bargaining table. And the guild kind of dared him to do it. Basically said, you want to do that? Like, fine, bring a lawsuit. But that created this sort of weird Venn diagram of opposition, because to get rid of the Seattle Police Union's ability to bargain on this stuff was actually seen as a gigantic threat to labor and union rights more broadly. So you have lefty lawmakers in
Sure.
Olympia and labor unions saying, no, we don't want that either.
Right.
And so the guild was at a point where they never had to do anything that Robart said. And I think that has been the biggest challenge to this is for everything the consent decree has done, which I think is a lot, it never touched collective bargaining. And therefore, it is always going to be this battle every contract where the city has to basically pay through the nose to get accountability measures in the contract.
Man, this is, you're right, another one of the many anticlimactic parts of this as we see the wrapping up of a consent decree that I know has dominated the news cycle for you and me for the better part of the past decade plus here. But it is gone now. We'll see what the developments are that come out of that. And we'll definitely see how the different candidates look at that as they come through the campaigning process here this fall. Well, coming up here, we're talking about public safety tools that are being used by the city attorney's office. How's that going? How are those tools being used? Are they being effective? Let's check it out. We're talking about that on Now Hear This. Well, it's been more than a year since the Seattle City Council implemented legislation to deal with some major public safety issues. SOTA, the Stay Out of Drug Area bill, SOAP, Stay Out of Areas of Prostitution, and illegal street racing, too. How are those bills working? The council heard about that at its Public Safety Committee meeting this week. And while City Attorney Ann Davison did note a series of successes with these new bills, she also said there are several cases where officers are not enforcing these laws.
We have to have the people, the resources to actually then follow through with the implementation of the law. These laws being on paper and people doing the work, it won't show up if we're not following through on the work. So we can come back like we did here to be that reflection to you of what tools you put in place and how they have improved the situation.
David, this was a very complicated presentation for me. It felt like one part council presentation, one part Ann Davison trying to campaign a little bit. She, of course, trying to get reelected after losing the primary to Erica Evans by more than 22 points. What did you draw from this presentation? Are these different public safety measures working? What do you think?
They are being used more than they used to. Working, I suppose, is a different question. I wrote a while back about how in the first 3 months of the SOAP and SOTA laws, they were basically not used at all.
Yeah.
And they didn't exactly blame the police department and the mayor's office, but they did a little bit blame the police department and the mayor's office, basically saying that the priorities had not shifted enough so that officers were not making the kinds of arrests that would lead to SOAP and SOTA orders. Now it appears the officers are starting to do that more. I think the number of SOTA orders was 115. Number of SOAP was something like 32. So they are being used. There's a question of enforceability once these SOTA orders are passed down, which is you put this on somebody, good chance this person was arrested because they were using fentanyl or some other really intense drug. Maybe they have mental health crises. Now you're asking them to abide by an order to keep out of a place that they have probably frequented quite regularly and perhaps have some form of community, no matter what we think of that particular community.
Right.
And so that's the kind of question mark about the work part. The orders are starting to be passed down, whether or not that is, well, A, keeping people out of that area, and B, whether that is an effective strategy more broadly to sort of permanently address the problem. These are open questions. But yeah, compared to how these laws were being used when they were first rolled out, implementation has certainly picked up.
Yeah, and I guess what I was trying to figure out was the connection between these interactions with SOAP and SOTA and when that might lead to an arrest in some cases. It looks like there are some numbers that are increasing there, but also diversions, because I thought it was interesting to hear from Councilmember Rivera here who's saying, well, there aren't a lot of, in fact, there were none. There were no SOAP or SOTA situations in her district, but she noticed that there were still some arrests being made. And so it almost raised the question for me, well, do we really need these SOAP and SOTA laws to overlay the situation to actually make arrests? I don't know. Help me out with that thought, because I'm not sure if this is an extra piece of bureaucracy or a helpful tool, I guess, at some point.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is they're trying to give a break to the areas that bear the biggest brunt here, which is, I think we all kind of know what areas we're talking about. Third Avenue, Chinatown, International District, certain parts of Capitol Hill, Pioneer Square. Yep. Aurora, of course, with the prostitution side of this.
Yep.
So the idea behind this was always kind of place-based, which is, and some of this comes out of an audit that was done by the auditor that basically said, hey, you've got a lot of issues, particularly with shoplifting and theft and drug use. City, we think you should focus more on location rather than sort of broadly. And And that is what they're trying to do here, which is let's give these areas a break, so-called. Whether or not that is actually what's happening, again, I don't know. And, is it leading to more of the kind of diversion work that most people in City Hall seem to agree they want? I think it's notable that Lisa Dugard, the head of the Public Dignity Action, which has lead and co-lead in the kind of main diversion programs in the city, was an opponent of this law, voiced skepticism about whether or not it made sense to penalize people for doing something which is not inherently a crime, which is being in a certain place in the city.
Yes, right.
And whether that would in fact, disrupt diversion efforts. And again, I think it's still early to know, and we're talking about really complicated cases here.
Sure.
I will point out that that is the kind of fundamental flaw in a lot of these criminal justice approaches, which is there does appear to be quite a few kind of emergency responses. There are a lot of avenues that can be taken, both police and non-police and with laws or whatever, to address kind of emergency, acute situations. There's not all that much to follow up on that work. And I think that's the argument that Lisa Dugard and Lead makes, is that all of these things, whatever they might be, are okay if you want to address emergencies. But if you want to actually get somebody to stop returning to a place that they have been returning to for a long time and causing trouble, you need something more than an emergency response.
Absolutely true. Great observation there. Thank you for that, David. I do want to talk a little bit more about the Seattle mayor's race. We've been discussing this over the past several weeks as we get nearer to Election Day. And David, you worked on a story recently in the Times with Jim Brunner about Mayor Harrell's political consultant. Christian Sinderman helped him on his transition into office in 2021. This was a contract that kept getting extended. Sounds like about 3 years, as it turns out, so that Sinderman was helping with city policy, but also helping with other political candidates like Erica Evans for city attorney, for example, Dion Foster for city council, who are trying to beat out some incumbents this fall. David, what was your end take on this? It doesn't exactly smell right, but it also doesn't sound like it's illegal that the mayor was doing this. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, that was basically the conclusion of the city's top ethics person, Wayne Barnett, which is exactly that. I don't think this is illegal, but it feels a little strange and it's a little different. And I think what's strange about it, you'd have to be naive to think that there is not crossover or intense political considerations in city government. They think about, all mayors think about these things. And there is, of course, crossover between politics and city hall governance. I can think of a number of people who worked on so-and-so's campaign and then transitioned with them into government. The thing here that's different is Christian was doing both at the same time, that he was on contract to do basically a staff person's work. He was taking on fairly significant portfolios, but was at the same time still in that world of politics. He was still running his firm. It was not technically a full-time job in the mayor's office. And he was really involved in the most sensitive discussions and probably, honestly, some of the most boring discussions in the mayor's office around just governing the city. And so that just raises the question for me, and I think for Jim, of is there a difference, I suppose, between thinking of what's good for Mayor Bruce Harrell and his reelection chances and thinking of what's best for the city? And I think there's actually a debate probably to be had about that.
Yeah.
Christian and the mayor, I would argue, know that if the mayor is making good on the promises that he was elected on, that's good for him, it's good for the city, it's good for everyone. And that's kind of what Christian's there to do, is to help him execute on the agenda that he said he was going to enact. I think there's another piece, though, that, some decisions are politically unpopular and difficult to do, particularly at a time when the budgets are tight. And so I think Christian's involvement, I genuinely, to my core, don't have a strong conclusion about firmly whether this is a good thing or a bad thing or whatever, but it is different. It raises interesting questions to me. And, ones that I think it just puts the city into a territory that it hasn't been in before, that I find really interesting.
I do too. I thought it was very unusual. And I always think about how Mayor Harrell has used the One Seattle motto and essentially inserted it into just about everything, the One Seattle comprehensive plan, all these different One Seattle pieces. And it sounds great, but it's also a campaign slogan. This is something that he brought up in 2021, and it's been woven into a lot of different parts of city government now. So I've always felt that separation there too. I did want to mention this one part. Council President Sarah Nelson talked to you about this story. She wasn't really happy about this setup at all. I think her concerns were that I guess here's Sinderman working for the mayor and also working for people like her opponent in the city council race. Can you talk about that piece? Because I thought that was an interesting split there, that Nelson felt really left out in the cold by the mayor, I guess.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting too, which is that she, even before it became official, she kind of knew, there's the telephone game in city politics. She was hearing that she was going to get an opponent in Dion Foster and that she was going to be represented by Christian Sinderman. And she was hearing this at the same time as she's seeing that Christian is in the mayor's office. And to her mind, that made it really difficult for her to have sort of honest, open conversations with the mayor because she felt like she was then basically giving information to the person who was trying to unseat her. And the counter argument that the mayor's office makes is, where's the evidence of that ever actually happening? We had a line between politics and governance. And, by the way, come 2025, we didn't renew the contract so we could, knowing it was an election year, so we could kind of keep that separation. And so, I mean, I think that has been the strongest pushback from the mayor's office on this stuff, which is they argue that there are not super concrete, clear examples of this arrangement ever being a problem for running City Hall or voters or taxpayer dollars or anything like that, and that Christian brings a valuable skill set to City Hall. But at the same time, that argument is asking for a lot of trust, I suppose. I mean, that might all be true, but it is. You can imagine the same scenario playing out with somebody who is not trying to uphold the sort of highest ideals of City Hall. And so it is a story about the relationship that Christian Sinderman has in the mayor's office. But also, for me, it's a bigger story about where should we draw the line between campaigning and city government, and have we defined it clearly enough?
Yeah, I know Nelson was asking about that. You also talked to former Councilmember Peterson for that story, who raised some concerns about it as well. It's interesting to see where the different political allegiances, where they were, where they're going, and what happens with this election with a story like this too. So very interested to see what happens with the fallout from that, David. And thank you for some great reporting to you and Jim on that. All right, well, coming up, what happens when a public official tries to keep the doors open of a private company? Is this one of those tree falling in the woods kind of questions? Well, we're talking about a battle over a Fred Meyer store in North Seattle. That's coming up on What's Next. David, I wanted to ask about this. Your colleague Paul Roberts wrote about this recently. So there's this Fred Meyer store in Lake City, slated to be shut down. Company says there are issues with theft and regulatory challenges that make the business unviable. Also, the land is worth a lot, $25 million. They might just sell it too. Now, naturally, neighbors want to keep their local grocery store around. You have State Rep Daria Farivar of the 46th District up there in North Seattle, and reportedly City Council Member Deborah Juarez trying to find some answers, talking to Fred Meyer about this. I just wanted to ask this bigger question about this. Do you think local leaders can really do anything over what appears to be a tough but maybe understandable business decision?
Not exactly. No, I don't think so. I mean, so I'm trying to think of what it would take. I mean, you can negotiate. Sure, you can have a conversation with Kroger and maybe try and offer them some things. And I don't know what those things look like. There are, of course, very strict rules around gifts to private entities. It's
Can't do it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can't give financial incentives to private entities to do things. But, maybe if they plead hard enough, Kroger will decide not to close the store. But that's the extent of it. The Mayor Harrell is proposing legislation that would ban basically restrictive covenants on grocery stores that forbid spaces from being used by a competitor to in the business that had it before. As far as I can tell, there aren't that many of these, and I don't think that was the case of this particular Fred Meyer, but sort of broad theme of at least trying to replace an exiting grocery store with a new grocery store and make it easier to do that. I don't doubt that theft was a problem at that Fred Meyer. Also, I think Paul's story had the good point, which is that just is $25 million for that property. It's a very valuable property. And if you've been in that Fred Meyer, the whole second floor is basically like looks like more like a Target or something like that. Yeah. A lot of clothes and supplies. And, we know that people are ordering a lot of that stuff on Amazon. So there's probably a business case to be made that it's just more valuable for Kroger to sell that space than it is to keep operating a 2-story department store in that way.
There was some talk about
sounds like some of the conversations are.
Yeah, I was going to say there was some talk about can we keep it around and keep it as just a 1-story, which I guess would involve some investment from the company too, right?
Yeah, which again, you're all asking basically a favor from Kroger, which they can or can't do. It's not, they have no obligation to make any decision based on what city officials ask them for. Yeah. Katie Wilson, I will point out, has said that she wants to explore this question of publicly backed grocery stores, similar to what Zohran Mamdani talks about in New York. Opens up a lot of other questions about how you do that and whether that makes sense. That, again, isn't an answer to the Fred Meyer situation, but something that she brought up also.
Yeah, last piece on this. Any larger issue that you draw from this in terms of the demand or lack of demand for commercial real estate in the Seattle market? It seemed like this property was set to go, but I know there have been some other stores around that area, North Seattle, that have not been bought up all that quickly. I didn't know what you made of that.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, my hunch is that this is just a really huge property.
Yeah.
In an era when it's just not that profitable to be running. I think I was looking at the parcel viewer. I think it's like 20,000 square feet or something like that.
Okay.
It's just enormous. Yeah. So, I think that is a piece of it. Smaller grocery stores maybe can do a little bit better, but we know that grocery margins are not particularly huge.
Right.
I think even Kroger's profit margin was like 2% or something. It's not enormous, even though in raw dollar terms, it sounds quite large. Mm-hmm. So, it's a tricky thing. I used to live right there back in the day. And it is significant for that to go away because there are no other grocery stores. There's a grocery outlet nearby, but that is not great grocery store, if I'm being honest. And then there's a Safeway, but you got to go up a hill. And that, if you're walking I think a lot of people walk or bike to that Fred Meyer, and losing that will be significant to that community.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you for that, David. I do need to wrap up with you, and I am going to guess that you've seen this viral video of a dad at an MLB game in Miami against the Phillies. This guy, so Harrison Bader hits the home run. Dad gives the ball to his 10-year-old kid. Then a woman with all her Phillies gear on runs onto the scene and berates the dad into giving the ball to her. The uproar has been insane. There's one group that's offering this mystery woman $5,000 if she gives the ball back, but she has to write, "I'm sorry" on it. I know I'm piling on here, David, but the instant a ball like that touches a kid's hand, it's over. It's got to be end of story, right? I mean, isn't that the deal?
I would say that I would go further and say the instant a ball touches your hand and you are over the age of 25, you are obligated to look around and find
a kid,
child and give it to them.
Yeah. The corollary. Sorry, go ahead.
I saw that. I was frustrated by it as everybody. Also, I don't think this woman's life deserves to be ruined over it. No. I did. There was kind of a side corollary there, which was, don't mess with Phillies fans. That seems like kind of next level, man, for sure. So, yikes. Well, anyway, let's hope we all are able to give that ball to a kid. That's your next game. Think about it, folks. It's the right thing to do. All right. Well, thank you, David. Thanks, everybody listening also to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. If you want to be a patron, you can do it. Please consider a pledge of $5 per month or more on Patreon to be a patron. You can hear this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen, we are there. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.